And the final reading is from Matthew chapter 16, verses 21 to 26, and it's the Message Bible translation. Then Jesus made it clear to his disciples that it was now necessary for him to go to Jerusalem, submit to an ordeal of suffering at the hands of the religious leaders, be killed, and then on the third day be raised up alive. Peter took him in hand, protesting, "Impossible, Master! That can never be!" But Jesus didn't swerve. "Peter, get out of my way. Satan, get lost. You have no idea how God works." Then Jesus went to work on his disciples. "Anyone who intends to come with me has to let me lead. You're not in the driver's seat. I am. Don't run from suffering. Embrace it. Follow me, and I'll show you how. Self-help is no help at all. Self-sacrifice is the way, my way, to finding yourself, your true self. What kind of deal is it to get everything you want but lose yourself? What could you ever trade your soul for?" This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. Thank you, Peter, for the reading. When I was thinking about these readings this week, the film from several years ago made by US former Vice President Al Gore came to mind, An Inconvenient Truth. You may or may not be familiar with this movie, but it was highlighting the issue of climate change and some of the solutions, if you like, of what we could do to address climate change. And that movie title seems ever more appropriate to me because climate change is an issue that won't go away. It's our reality that we are living with. And it's inconvenient because it means we have to reflect on how we're living. We have to perhaps change how we're living. And of course, since that movie was made nearly 15 years ago, many people, many governments, including our own, many businesses who profit from exploiting fossil fuels have decided not to change, not to do anything different to how they've always lived. And the problem hasn't gone away because it's just a matter of physics and carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere and so forth. But addressing it has got more urgent. And this is one of the issues we might come back and look at in more detail in September, because you'll have seen in the newsletter that we're proposing to focus on creation for the 4 weeks of September. There's, I guess, a movement that's been going for 10 or 15 years now, setting aside September as the season of creation. So that's what we'll be doing as well. But coming back to our readings and this thought of an inconvenient truth, I'm sure when Moses encountered God at the burning bush and had the start of the conversation that we heard, he thought what God was asking of him was most inconvenient. You see, Moses had been raised in Egypt as the adopted son of the Pharaoh, but he'd had to flee Egypt because he'd killed a person. He'd seen an Egyptian oppressing a Jewish slave. He'd got a bit mad and had killed the Egyptian and run away. And he'd been out of the country for a long time, just living a quiet life, minding his own business as a shepherd, until this day where he encounters God. And God calls him to go back to Egypt, to go back to Pharaoh and get Pharaoh to release the Jewish slaves. And I'm sure Moses thought, oh no, I'm not going to go back to Egypt. And if you read this chapter and the next chapter in Exodus, Moses comes up with excuse after excuse as to why he couldn't possibly do what God's asking. He doesn't have the right skills. He doesn't have the right temperament. You know, God, please choose somebody else. You see, it was really inconvenient for Moses to go back to Egypt and do what God was asking. And more than inconvenient, it was probably a real threat to his life because he was still a wanted man in Egypt. Then there's the gospel reading, and Jesus has no sooner finished praising Peter for his insight to correctly identify Jesus as, yes, the Messiah and the Son of the living God, and Jesus goes on to say what sort of Messiah he'll be, that he'll be a suffering Messiah, that as the Messiah, he will die at the hands of the religious authorities. And for Peter, this is too much. It's too inconvenient again. You know, if you are the Messiah, Jesus, then surely you ride into Jerusalem on your war horse and defeat the Romans. You don't get killed by them. And when Jesus goes on to say, well, if anyone actually wants to be my disciple, if anyone actually wants to follow in my footsteps and be my follower, you have to be prepared to walk this same way of self-denial and suffering. And again, talk about a mighty inconvenient truth for Jesus to be telling them. It was kind of unthinkable for Peter. So for both Moses and Peter, in a way, what they're being called to is more than inconvenient. It probably sounded to both of them a bit like a death sentence. For Moses, going back and confronting Pharaoh may well have got him killed. If Peter hung around with Jesus and Jesus himself was arrested and killed, then maybe Peter would be next because he was the leader of the disciples. Certainly for Moses, it was the death of his dream of just living a quiet life, minding his own business. And for Peter, maybe it was the death of his dream of who Jesus was and what his mission would represent. And in some ways, both Moses and Peter suffer from some of the symptoms of grief when we hear bad news. Peter denies it. Moses bargains. And they're two of the ways that has been observed that people deal with grief. Jesus, of course, has had to go through the same sort of pathway in wrestling with God about his future. And maybe he bargained with God. And we see a little bit of that in the prayer in the Garden of Gethsemane. You know, God, is there another way? Can you make this cup pass from me? But in the end, Jesus embraces the call and goes to the cross. Now, we are used, I think, to asking God and expecting God to bless us, to heal us, to make our life good, to make it comfortable even, but certainly not to place us in harm's way. And that reminded me of something that John Wesley wrote, and some of you may be familiar with this if you've ever had a covenant service. So in thinking about, you know, sometimes God's call to us is good and it's encouraging and uplifting, and sometimes it's harder. I want to read you the words from the covenant service. Christ has many services to be done. Some are easy, others are difficult. Some bring honour, others bring reproach. Some are suitable to our natural inclinations and material interests. Others are contrary to both. In some, we may please Christ and please ourselves. In others, we cannot please Christ except by denying ourselves. Yet the power to do all these things is given us in Christ, who strengthens us. Therefore, let us make this covenant with God our own, trusting in the eternal promises and relying on divine grace. So they're words of John Wesley. The inconvenient truth, I suppose, is that Jesus never promises that our life will always be easy, always be comfortable, always be free from difficulty or suffering. But Jesus says we need to be prepared at least to embrace these things if we truly want to follow Jesus. Now, that's a message that none of us really want to hear, I suspect. But what does this way of Jesus look like? This way that may involve suffering, but certainly also involves God's presence with us, God's strengthening, God's endurance with us. And I think the Romans reading gives us an inkling of what this life might look like that Jesus is talking about. And I'd encourage you later this afternoon or during the week to go back to that Romans reading. It's a kind of how to live the life summary. There's probably 20 instructions there. Boom, 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 one after another. And certainly this life that Jesus talks about, which in John's Gospel is called the abundant life, is a life that's lived in community. It's not something that, as an individual follower of Jesus, we just go off and do our own thing. No, it's very much communal, how we relate to one another. It's built around love. It's built around doing good, resisting evil and doing good to others and helping others and serving others. And as it says, there are times for rejoicing. There are times when this life is going to be fantastic and we need to rejoice with one another. But there will be times when this life Jesus speaks of is hard and difficult, and there will be weeping. And Paul is saying, yes, well, we need to weep with one another and comfort one another and encourage one another at those times. When you look through this list, spend some time and ask God to highlight for you if there is one or more areas where you might want to focus on, where God might be calling you to focus on, where perhaps you need some extra encouragement. So that would be a good thing to do, just to think if there's one or two of these where you could really try to focus on them and make them a priority in the days or the weeks to come. I think, to me, the other take-home message from the readings this week is, yes, God's call can sometimes be mighty inconvenient and difficult. But I don't know if you picked up in the reading from Exodus, when Moses says, now, who am I? Why would you pick me, God? Choose someone else. And God's response is, I will be with you, Moses. I will walk with you each step of this journey, however difficult it is. And I think we need to hold in balance, therefore, the fact that sometimes God does call us to difficult tasks, a difficult path to walk. But God also promises to be with us each step of the way. And we might remember the words of Psalm 23, that even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, you are with me, Lord, and your rod and staff, they comfort me. Amen.